Hey, what's up, YouTube world? It is your girl here, the Venusian Bull, back here with another video. I know it has been a minute, but I am happy to be back here again doing videos. And this video, or videos, because it's probably going to be broken up, is going to be specifically about the houses. So I'm going to be breaking down the houses 1 through 12 of the natal chart down. There are only 12 houses, so I'm going to be breaking all of them down and give you an idea and a sense of what each house represents in terms of a natal chart. Because, you know, you have the houses represent the where certain things are happening or certain things in your life, certain life experiences and things like that. So we're going to talk about the where because I've discussed the signs, I've discussed the planets. I've even discussed some aspects. So we got to get knee deep into these houses. So without any further ado, let's get to it. All right. So the first house is actually also represents the cusp of the first house, also represents your rising sign or your ascendant. And if you have been watching my channel, listen to my channel, you know the only way that you can get the ascendant is to know your time of birth. So in order to get a sense of your own personal birth chart and where the planets fall in your individual houses, you will need to know your birth time. Just knowing your date of birth is not going to give you that information. There is a such thing called chart rectification, and people can kind of figure out your birth time based off of your physical characteristics and certain experiences in your life. But in order to get that immediate answer, you would have to know your birth time. So I just need to stress this. If you would like to have that information and for it to be accurate, you do need to have your birth time to see where the planets fall in your birth chart. Now, back to the first house. So the first house is your rising sign or your ascendant. It represents, your identity. It represents your physical appearance. It represents how the outside world sees you. So a lot of the time, especially if your rising sign is like a totally different type of energy than your sun sign, a lot of the times they're going to see that rising sign first before they see the sun sign. So yeah, your first house is big on physical characteristics. That's why you can kind of look at someone if you know the certain traits of the signs and kind of figure out what their rising sign is based off of their physical characteristics. So the first house, it vibrates to Aries. So a lot of this is similar characteristics. Each house vibrates to a sign. So the first house vibrates to Aries, and a lot of the same characteristics for Aries, they also apply to the first house. So this is, this is very headstrong. This is very determined. This is energetic energy. This is quick energy. Also, the first house can also pertain to your name as well. So it can pertain to that. So you can kind of sometimes simple names, you may have an Aries rising or something like that, but you have like an Aquarius rising, you might have a more complicated name, or, a Scorpio rising, a name that's difficult to pronounce or spell or something along those lines. But the first house in general, it represents your identity, and it represents who you are, but it more or less represents how other people see you. Like the first house is like the first impression. That's the best way that I can explain it. So it's the first impression that people get when they see you. Okay. And then of course, if you have planets in the first house, it is going to amplify that first house. Obviously, everybody has a sign on each house cusp, but you may not have planets in each house. But if you do have planets in the first house, it is going to intensify the energy of that first house. So let's say you have like Mars in the first house. I mean, like your first house is pretty lit having Mars there. I mean, you're automatically determined. You're a go-getter. You're aggressive. You go after what you want. You don't play no games. Like pretty much Mars in any sign in the first house would make you that way. Possibly like a Pisces or Scorpio might dim it a little bit, but still you got Mars in the first house. So you have it's like a very recognizable type of energy at first impression. Even if it may come off as quiet, it's a recognizable energy, and immediately people know, okay, you're going after what you want. Like you get that vibe, you know what I mean? So that's just kind of an example of that. Another planet that I wanted to mention that could affect the way that you look. Well, all the planets in the first house can affect the way you look, but Venus in the first house can manifest a very beautiful person. Like Venus has to deal with beauty, and Venus in the first house can make someone very attractive, very, symmetrical and things like that. No matter what sign it's in, really, but it's just the presence of Venus in the first house, because it has to do with your physical appearance, and while Saturn can kind of have the opposite effect, not saying that it makes you ugly or anything like that, not by any means, but it can, Saturn in the first house can identify like some type of, like an ailment, or it's like you feel older than what you are, or you always have to really work hard for everything that you're trying to achieve, and things like that. Or there could have been something traumatic that happened during your birth, like when you were actually coming out of the canal. You always got to look at the first house as also like those beginning years of your life, beginning weeks, you actually being born, and that type of energy. So that's another thing to think about. So that is the first house. Moving on to the second house. Now, the second house vibrates to the sign Taurus, and the second house has to deal with money, values, possessions, self-worth, just to kind of keep it short. So when you're talking about, the second house, this is how you kind of deal with finances, how you deal with money, kind of how you navigate, how you earn money. And this is earning your own money. This is being self-sufficient, and this is earned income, right? Your own personal income. So like basically how you make a living. Well, not really how you make a living, because that's more of a 10th house, but this is like more or less how you earn money, right? So you have the second house doing that. It also represents your values and your possessions. So it could be like your values and your like stance on certain like maybe your faith, or it could be your stance on certain like social issues, or just your values and your like morals to a certain extent. It's like having, high standards, and having morals is more Sagittarius, but still in the second house, it does have to do with values and self-worth. So it is about having a high, self-esteem when it's vibrating on the most most positive level, the lightest manifestation rather. So we're looking at not just the material things. It's a little bit more than skin deep in the second house, although the second house does have to do with the material. You know what I mean? Living in a material world, and I am a material girl. That's Taurus all day. That's Taurus energy. So it is about acquiring things, acquiring, assets, acquiring material items. And it can be, if you have planets in this house, it can be kind of, possessive, you know what I mean? So that's kind of how the second house operates. So let me give an example of a planet in the second house. So let's say that you have your moon in the second house. So you are like you could be emotionally connected to the way that you earn money. Like you can't just have any type of job. You have to do something that is emotionally satisfying for you. Also, you're always trying to make sure that your values are like, the moon is very emotional. So when you put that in the second house isn't really an emotional house, but you put it there, and your self-worth can get a little wonky. You can have those bouts of where you doubt yourself and things like that. Also possibly like with like Neptune being there or something like that. But like Jupiter is a great planet to have in the second house, because Jupiter is all about abundance. It's about prosperity. It's about wealth and generosity. So for lack of a better word, Jupiter in the second house, money, 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 money. So there's that. Especially Jupiter in Taurus in the second house, you gonna make some money some kind of way. I don't know, like you hit the lottery, I don't know, but you're gonna make some money some kind of way if you got Jupiter in Taurus in the second house. All right, so moving right along to the third house. Now, the third house vibrates to Gemini. So the third house is all about communication. No, it's about other things, but communication is a big portion of the third house. It also has to deal with your early childhood and growing up and like your school age, like grade school years. It has to deal with your neighbors and like siblings, close family members, and the third house is akin to Gemini. It represents your neighborhood. It represents the hood. You know what I'm saying? So the third house is very much that. So if you have a lot of like planets in your third house, or even if you have like just Gemini on the third house cusp or Aquarius on the third house cusp, this would make somebody very inquisitive, very smart, astute child. You know what I'm saying? That asks a lot of questions. They probably get really good grades. They're probably very attentive, but they're definitely the talkers. If this is specifically if you have like a Gemini or an Aquarius on the third house cusp or something like that, even Virgo on the third house cusp. So this is like a mercurial, type of energy. And it's fun. It's a lighthearted energy. The third house also has to deal with short distance travel. So it has to deal with, your cars traveling short distance. It could be like subways, trains, or any type of, transportation. And I just want to say that knowing about the houses, it really, really comes in handy when you're talking about transits. So like the current transits that are happening in the sky, at the present moment, you see how they're going through your houses. So even if you don't have planets in a particular house, at some point, there's always planets that are going through your houses because they're transiting. You know what I'm saying? So it's like natally, you don't have anything in your third house, but there are transits that are happening in your third house. So think about that when I'm telling you the characteristics of these houses, because you might be having your sun transiting one of these houses. You might have your sun transiting the third house or your Mars transiting the third house or something like that. So you got to keep that in mind. And if sometimes in transit, in terms of transits, if you have a lot of activity going through your third house, in terms of transportation, you want to be kind of careful about, like accidents or any type of car related, malfunctions or anything like that, delays, airport delays, that's more ninth house, but you could still get that, especially if you have like Mercury transiting the third house. Most definitely. So definitely look to the third house for communication, media, the internet, social media. Social media is the 11th house, but the third house is also media as well. And just kind of having that presence. So if you have a lot of energy in the third house, it would make you like, a great speaker, a public speaker. And, just having the ability, like the gift of gab, having the ability to talk to anybody, a good writer, things like that. Just think along, that communication spectrum all around. You can kind of talk to anybody, make conversations with anybody, that type of thing. All right. So moving right along to the fourth house, which vibrates to Cancer. Now, the fourth house is all about the home. It's about security. It is about comfortability. And it is about family. It is about your foundation. So when it comes to the fourth house and whatever energy you may have in the fourth house, it shows that those types of things are very important to you, being family oriented, having a strong foundation. And this is also, if you have planets in the fourth house, can denote like kind of a private person, more closed off, less out there to the masses and more, kind of closed up in your shell, like a Cancer crab would be, because Cancer vibrates to the fourth house. Now, this has been kind of a debate a lot in the astro realm. The way that I was taught was that the fourth house represents the father and the 10th house represents the mother. And most astrologers do it the other way around, where the fourth house represents the mother and the 10th house represents the father, for obvious reasons, because Cancer vibrates to the fourth house. The moon rules Cancer. The moon is feminine energy. The moon is like a female. So this and that and the third. The idea behind the fourth house representing the father is the foundation part, whether there is a foundation or not, I have noticed that when I have looked at people's charts and I have looked at the fourth house, it does kind of represent the father, or and the 10th house represent the mother, or it could be like the more like dominant parent in the household. And you can find kind of similarities if you ask certain questions. If you ask the right questions, then you can really determine whether the fourth house is representing the mother or the father. But it's more or less the father, and it doesn't have to, the father doesn't have to be, he could be in your life or not in your life. It's more or less the energy that it's giving off, whatever sign is on that house cusp. You know what I'm saying? So if you have Capricorn on the fourth house, you would have a very stern upbringing, maybe stern father, disciplinarian, that type of thing. But if you have like Sagittarius on the fourth house cusp, you may have had a father that traveled a lot and that, was here today, gone tomorrow, but very fun and energetic and jovial. But, you couldn't really rely on him that much. You know what I'm saying? But you can rely on that Capricorn dad. So, got to take it with a grain of salt, but it's kind of with looking at the entire chart to be able to tell. But also with the fourth house, a big theme is home, like your actual home, like even real estate. You got a lot of energy in your fourth house. You might be an interior designer. You might do a lot of home renovations and things like that. If you have some things negatively aspecting your fourth house, you may always have to get like repair work done in your house. Like if you have Neptune in the fourth house, and maybe plumbing issues. If you have Uranus in the fourth house, and maybe like electrical issues. You know what I'm saying? Things like that. So keep that in mind. Oh, and fourth house has to deal with like generations, and it has to deal with familial, lines and things like that. So it may be to the point where it's like has to deal with, legacies, from each generation, or even like generational curses within the family. So keep that in mind if you got a heavy-handed fourth house or transits to your fourth house. All right. Now the fifth house vibrates to Leo. And the fifth house has to deal with, fifth house is so fun. It has to deal with, creativity and entertainment and children. It also has to deal with sex and dating. And it's just where your fun is. Like, how do you like to have fun? How do you express yourself as well? You know what I mean? Think Leo, and then you get the fifth house, right? So I just want everybody to be careful if you are a woman and you are having transits happening through your fifth house, and you are, sexually active or something like that, be careful, because the pregnancy might happen. I'm just saying, the fifth house rules children. Let's say you got like Jupiter in the fifth house. A lot of kids, okay? The potential for a lot of kids, okay? Or you have Jupiter transiting the fourth house. But also entertainment, games, fun. This is like the fun, like kind of like youthful, spirit. This is, also has to deal with gambling. So it could be gambling in casino, or it could be, gambling, in other ways. You just take a gamble on certain things. But it's the fifth house, no matter what sign is on this cusp, the fifth house is going to represent your creative expression, because the fifth house is all about being creative and expressing yourself. So if you have like Pisces on the fifth house, you're going to be very creative in the arts. Like the Pisces are the artistes of the Zodiac. So if you have that on the fifth house, that's an amazing placement. But, if you have like Gemini on the fifth house, you're going to express yourself through talking, writing, you know what I mean? You might even be a rapper or something like that. You might be a news correspondent, but you're always going to be expressing yourself verbally, you know what I'm saying? So definitely, keep that in mind. So it's all about self-expression. It's about fun. It's a very happy area, but obviously if you have some malefic planets like a Saturn, or like actually Mars in the fifth house is great. Mars is great in the fifth house, but if you have like Pluto or like Saturn in the fifth, then it could kind of bring that energy down a little bit that the fifth house would normally represent. So keep that in mind, especially if you're normally like a happy-go-lucky person, and then all of a sudden Saturn is like transiting your fifth house. that could be the reason why your energy has gone down, because Saturn is transiting your fifth house. So definitely keep that in mind. People with heavy fifth house energy, they love children. They love to be around children. They love to play with children. They probably the coach of a sports team or something. Oh, very athletic. I forgot to mention that. Athletic. All of the fire houses are very athletic. So I forgot to mention that about the first house. A lot of energy there will make a very athletic person. Fifth house, same thing. So yeah, that's the fifth house. Moving on to the sixth house. So the sixth house is akin to Virgo, and the sixth house is all about order. It's about routine. It's about health and wellness. It's about organization. It's about your daily routines and also your work life, not career, because that's the 10th house. So the sixth house is about your daily work. What do you do for work on an everyday basis? Your interaction with your coworkers, your interaction with your boss, the actual work that you do on, a regular basis. So that could represent the sixth house. Also, your diet and exercise habits are a big component of the sixth house. And the sixth house can also indicate if you have certain illnesses, or if you get if you get sick all the time or something like that, that could be indicated, by the sixth house. Again, if we're talking about malefics, if we're talking about Saturn and Pluto in the sixth house, you may have a chronic illness, or a constant illness that always comes back, or something like that. Or if you have Mercury in the sixth house, because, Mercury actually rules Virgo, and Virgo is akin to the sixth house. So you may have a lot of nerves and a lot of nervous energy and things like that. But the sixth house is kind of it's not a very popular house. It's not the fun house like the fifth house, but it is a necessary house, because you have to, create some type of stability and some type of routine for your life, whatever it is that you do, personally, especially when it comes to health, wellness, and, fitness and things. Mental health, very important. Go see that therapist. If you've been thinking about it, if you got heavy sixth house energy, do it. If you've been thinking about taking up that yoga class, do it. If you got that sixth house energy, you start getting energy going through your sixth house, all of a sudden you're going to start wanting to make yourself better, mentally and physically eating better. That could be something that could come about with transits going through your sixth house as well. So I just want to make sure there's not anything that, also in terms of work, it could also indicate maybe the people that you may have problems with at work, the types of people that you have problems with at work. Let's say that you have, I'm trying to pick a sign that I haven't used yet. Let's say that you have Cancer on the sixth house, and sixth house cusp. So you might be that kind of emotional type of worker, where you kind of have to feel it and you have to be in the moment. First off, Cancer on the sixth, probably working a regular 9 to 5 isn't the best thing, because they have to do work that's emotionally fulfilling, but we all got bills to pay. We got shit to do. So sometimes that's how it is, right? So if you have Cancer on the sixth house and you're dealing with a Capricorn boss, or even a Virgo boss or something like that, that's going to be very taxing to your emotional spirit. You know what I'm saying? So let's just say if you had Cancer on the sixth, try to get out of the whole 9 to 5 type of area as fast as you can, unless you're doing something that's really fulfilling to you, that maybe involves family, a family business. That's really good. Or even involves children, or nurturing something sixth house, notorious for working in the health field. If you got heavy sixth house energy, nurses, doctors, all of that, working CNAs, all of that, health field, definitely sixth house. And this is if you have sixth house energy. If there's not really anything in your sixth house, then not so much, unless you maybe have Virgo on the sixth house cusp, or maybe Scorpio on the sixth house cusp. So you might be into the health field or something like that. So the seventh house, moving on. All right, the seventh house vibrates to Libra. Okay, so the seventh house is the house of relationships, and it's the house of open enemies. It's also the house of contracts, legal documents. So not just marriage documents, but business partnerships and relationships and things like that. So the theme of the seventh house is all kinds of relationships with other people. It's really how you relate and how you interact with other people. And a lot of the times, if you kind of have a heavy-handed seventh house, relationships are very important to you. You value relationships. And a lot of times it's more of like the one-on-one type of relationships versus the 11th house, which is like groups, so you kind of crave that one-on-one interaction with a romantic partner, as well as, one-on-one interactions with friends and family and things like that. So the 7th house is very relationship oriented. So if you, kind of have something going through your 7th house, like a Uranus, that's really going to shake up your love life. And if you're already in a relationship and Uranus is going through your 7th house, that might indicate a breakup or a divorce, because you just need to separate and break, ties. But let's say you got Venus transiting the 7th house. Everything is beautiful. Everything is glorious. Everybody looks beautiful. Everybody's just, beauty. You know what I'm saying? Very beauty, influence, because it vibrates to Libra. So that's another thing. But also, like, if you have something like, a Saturn in your 7th house, it may be, actually you crave like those stable, relationships, but they're always difficult relationships with Saturn in the 7th house, most definitely. All right. So moving right along to the 8th house. And the 8th house vibrates to Scorpio. And the 8th house represents death, regeneration, transformation, other people's money, sex, intimacy, the occult. The 8th house represents a lot of things: taxes, liens, inheritance, insurance. Like, it represents a lot of different things. So it's a heavy-handed house. So when it comes to the 8th house and people having energy in that house, just know that these are very, very extremely intense people, okay? These are not people who are surface level people. They don't take shit lightly. They are very much about what's underneath, what's like beneath the surface, right? And remember how I talked about how the 2nd house was about earned income. Well, the 8th house is about joint income or other people's money. So this is the money you may acquire through a marriage. This is the money you may acquire through an inheritance. This is the money you may acquire through life insurance or things like that. It also has to deal with debt. Let me not forget that. 8th house also does have to deal with debt as well. So debt accumulated. Back to the sex part, though, the sex and intimacy part. People with a lot of energy in the 8th house really crave that intimacy. It's different than the 5th house, where the 5th house is just dating and it's just like casual sex, like, oh, I'm having fun. Like, that 8th house is like, you are a part of me and I am a part of you. We are evenly yoked. We bond together. We're stuck like glue. So you got to think about that Scorpio, that Plutonian influence on the 8th house. Like, the 8th house is just deep. Okay. The 8th house is very deep. It could be kind of, if you have energy in the 8th house, it could be kind of possessive and things like that. Also, not to be like a Debbie Downer, but the 8th house does represent death. So if you have a lot of energy in your 8th house, especially if it's malefic planets like Saturn, Pluto, even Neptune, and even Mars, in some instances, you may have experienced death over the course of your life in the literal sense, but you also may have experienced death figuratively. That's why you're constantly transforming. People who have heavy 8th house energy are always constantly transforming. So definitely keep that in mind. I could do a whole video on the 8th house, but we just don't have time. Also, paranormal activity, very much happening in the 8th house. And the occult, being into astrology, tarot, mediumship especially, because that Scorpio, that Plutonian energy, a lot of times they can kind of speak to the dead, the ancestors, and all of that type of stuff. That's the 8th house all day. Investigative work. Oh, I'm kind of coming up with stuff. So yeah, they make great detectives. And, if you have that energy in the 8th house as well, like if you have a transit going through the 8th house, you're like, why am I all of a sudden watching the ID channel all the time? Maybe you got Neptune transiting your 8th, or like Mercury or something like that. So yeah, there's that. All right. So next we have the ninth house, and the ninth house vibrates to Sagittarius. And the ninth house is about higher learning. It's about spirituality and religion. It's about long distance travel, foreign countries, foreign people. It's about like adventure and, it is about, being optimistic. And it's a very carefree placement. So if you have a lot of placements in the ninth house, that would make you very much travel oriented, very much wanting to learn. You also would be a great like teacher or professor, more like on the collegiate level. Ninth house energy, like, they stay getting more degrees. Like, I just got my bachelor's, I'm going to my master's, just got my master's, going to get my PhD, but I'm going to go get those. I'm going to like do the study abroad program or something like that. Like, that's Sagittarius all day. They're also full of fun and energy. So they just go on trips just to like do like some crazy shit, like, skydiving or, rock climbing, but they go to the Alps. Like, they're not doing anything in like their local areas. A lot of times if you have a lot of heavy ninth house energy, you're not going to end up living where you were born. Also, if you have a lot of ninth house energy, you may marry somebody or have an attraction for people that are of different cultures, different ethnicities, and things like that. Sagittarian energy just kind of likes everybody. They like a little bit of everything. You know what I'm saying? And they're just kind of like, it's a very happy-go-lucky type of energy, but very expansive, very knowledgeable, very philosophical. You know what I'm saying? These people people with heavy ninth house energy can almost give off that God complex a little bit. So that's the ninth house for you. Long distance travel, like planes and, ships and, things like that. So whereas the third house was short distance travel, ninth house, long distance travel. So let's say you got Mercury transiting the ninth house and it's retrograde, right? We're looking at flight delays, especially if you're traveling like internationally and stuff like that. So just keep that in mind when we're talking about transits. Or if you have like Venus in the ninth house, like you may be in a long distance relationship, or you may have to travel to go see your lover and things like that. So moving on to the 10th house. The 10th house vibrates to Capricorn, and the 10th house represents your career and your reputation, your like legacy. It's kind of how people see you for what you do in this world. Like, what are you contributing that is of significance and that is useful? So it's all about your reputation. It's all about your standing. 10th house has to deal with, the government and authority as well. And it's very, it's very, I don't want to say wealth driven. It's more like power driven. It's about, if you have a lot of energy in your 10th house, it's about having a stance. It's about making a mark. It's about making your legacy known. You know what I mean? So it's kind of following that fourth house. Fourth house is Cancer, and Cancer and Capricorn are opposite signs. So fourth house is about your foundation, and then the 10th house, we're going up. What legacy are you, leaving behind when you, leave this earth? And the 10th house, on the 10th house cusp, is your midheaven, and that represents your career. And based off of that sign, it represents like the type of career that you should have, or that you will be like fulfilled in, and things like that. So if you have a lot of energy in your 10th house, you may be all work, no play type of thing. You also will be very, very career oriented, very, very serious about your work. But on the other side, like if you have something like Uranus in your 10th house, you may always be changing careers. And I don't mean changing jobs. I mean changing careers. Like one day you're like an esteemed like law professor or something like that, and then you totally completely change careers and become like a music producer or something. That's what would happen if you had Uranus in the 10th, just as an example. But for the most part, I said Capricorn, but it vibrates Capricorn, but 10th house, very serious about their career. All right. 11th house is vibrates to Aquarius, and 11th house is all about groups and organizations and humanitarian work and like activism. It also has to deal with social media. Social media, very, very, very important for the 11th house. And it has to deal with friends. You know what I'm saying? It also has to deal with your hopes and wishes. So if you have a heavy 11th house energy, you're very, very prominent on social media. Like, Like social media is like your best friend. You live it, you breathe it, you eat it, you smell it. Like social media is it. And it's all about being a part of, groups and, you having a lot of friends, interacting with a lot of people. Like the 7th house was more like one-on-one interactions. And the 11th house is about the whole like group, the collective. And remember that about the 11th house in Aquarius energy. It's all about the collective and that type of thing. And also the 11th house, you can reap a lot of benefits because you know a lot of people. It is the networking house. So, this person who knows that person who knows that person that can get you a job. This person who knows that person who knows that person that can hook you up with somebody. You know what I'm saying? You got the hookup. If you got heavy 11th house energy, that's the hookup house. So not the hookup in terms of sex, but the hookup in like, you got a guy for this, you got a dude for that, you got somebody to fix this, you got somebody to do that type of thing. So that's very 11th house. And it's a very kind of lighthearted house. It's also an inventive house, think, aliens, space technology, all of that is very 11th house, flying cars, all of that type of jazz. All right. And last but not least is the 12th house, which vibrates to Pisces. So the 12th house, they say, is the most misunderstood house. It does represent self-undoings. It represents, prisons. It represents the unconscious mind. It represents also paranormal activity, but it's a little bit more intense even than the 8th house, believe it or not. It represents more of the spirituality aspect. Understand the 12th house also represents dreams. So you can have very, very, very prophetic dreams if you have a lot of 12th house energy. It also represents the imprisonment of the mind, as well as being physically imprisoned. Like if you got a lot of 12th house energy, it's possible that you might end up in jail or something like that. But if not, then you could be imprisoned in the mind. It's very difficult if you have heavy 12th house energy for you to voice how you feel, because you just have all of this internal shit going on. It's a deep ocean of thoughts and things like that. Again, I could do a whole video on the 12th house like I could for the 8th house. The water houses in general are deep, 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 deep as the ocean, especially the 12th house, because Pisces vibrates to the 12th house and represents the ocean. So yeah, think water. It's a very artistic house. That's the best way for the 12th housers to kind of channel their energy into artistic work, or even being being very charitable, helping people, helping the homeless, doing like missions and things like that, working in the health field, and things, being a psychologist, also 8th house, also 12th house, being a psychologist, and getting your mental health together. If you got heavy 12th house energy, please go see a therapist. If nobody else does, 12th housers, please. If you got that Pisces, Virgo axes, y'all need to be in that therapist chair, either in the therapist chair or being the person that is receiving the therapy. Most of the time, being the person receiving the therapy, because y'all got so much shit going on in your mind. Neptune rules Pisces, and that's the same energy as the 12th house. So it's just like this dreamy, like detached from reality type of thing. But remember, you're very psychic and you're very sensitive to energy. So those dreams that you're thinking, those dreams that you dream may actually come true. They may actually come to fruition. So it's almost like, be careful what you dream, be careful what you ask for, because that 12th house energy is very easy at manifesting things. So I want to thank you so much for listening to me describe the different houses of the zodiac, and I will see you for the next video. Peace.